one of the ways in which we had to understand the realities that the full-scale invasion brought to this country was in the second half of 2022 when we did a series of training sessions for the team to help us better understand how we help people in certain circumstances. And one of the trainings that we did was from an expert in helping people recover from sexual violence, because we've seen how many reports of Russians gang raping people in the occupied areas.
Hello and welcome to On the Edge with Philip Ittner. This week we're sitting down with my pal, Paul Niland, who's an Irish national, but he's been living here for many, many years, and it is his home. He is the founder and the head of Lifeline Ukraine, a mental health and suicide prevention hotline. Because in war, there are things that you can see, such as damaged buildings or sadly dead or wounded soldiers. That's tangible. It's visible. But also there are wounds and trauma that are internalized. They're deeply intimate and hidden from view. So we discuss all of this and so much more, but primarily we discuss Russia's cruelty and its war of terror and how Ukraine's population is bearing up under this intense strain. I hope you find it an insight into the character of this nation. Paul, thanks for coming and joining us here on The Edge. You have been in Ukraine for a very, very long time, but I want to talk to you first and foremost about Lifeline. Tell me the story of Lifeline Ukraine.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to sit down and have a chat with you. It's always good to see you.
Always good to see you.
What can I tell you about Lifeline Ukraine? If we're listening in the UK, then in the UK they have the Samaritans, and they've been there for 50 years. And I mean, I'm Irish by birth, but I grew up in the UK, and we just always knew, like, if you found yourself with troubled thoughts and you were considering doing something extreme like ending your life, that was who you'd turn to. There was a hotline that started when I was growing up in the UK called Childline, 0800 1111. I remember the number from the advert still, right? But Ukraine had never had anything like that. We'd never had a national suicide prevention hotline. So the acting Minister of Health at the time was Dr. Uliana Supran, and she simply copied me on an email, which was an internal discussion with the Ministry of Health. And she copied me on an email. She said, bring Paul Niland into the next meeting on this. And that was that. I was volunteered. I was given the task. But I immediately recognized I could do something, or I would be doing something really, really important for this country. And as you said, I've lived here for a long time. It's 21 years now. So
originally it starts with soldiers.
Yeah.
Who are fighting out in Donbass during that 2014-2022 period. So you're responding to it's a Veterans Affairs kind of deal. It's what we would call the VA in the United States. It's not that anymore. It's much larger, and you're taking along much more than just, and I say just, only soldiers. It's now spread because everybody is feeling the strain of this current situation. Talk to me a little bit about how Lifeline has developed.
You're entirely right that initially our focus, our raison d'être, our reason for coming together was to support veterans. And so you mentioned the VA. So when I agreed to take this on, I took a sheet of A4 paper out of the printer and I wrote, number one, best international practice. Number two, expanding to be the national suicide prevention hotline for everyone. And then number three, I wrote that I wanted us to be a catalyst for a national discussion about mental health more generally. So, I mean, it was always my intention, that we would widen our scope and who we support. and that it would always be it has always been my intention that we would be serving the citizens of Ukraine, not a particular demographic, but everybody in Ukraine. And if I were to try to quantify the effect that the full-scale invasion has had, you can see it through the demand for support from Lifeline Ukraine. Before the 24th of February, 2022, when the full-scale invasion began, we used to average 1,000 instances of support every single month. The demand now is 6,500 instances of support every month. And currently, due to our financial limitations, we're able to help around about 67%, 70% of those people who turn to us looking for support. So, we felt the effect, the psychological effect on the nation in a very, very significant way through the massive surge in demand for support from Lifeline Ukraine.
And those who have followed my channel for a long time before I started doing On the Edge will know that I did a vlog where I went and visited your facilities. Now, I think the facilities have changed, but I want to know, what is your current staff level? How many people do you have who are receiving calls either online or by phone or whatever methodology they use? How big is your staff now in comparison to the volume of interactions that you're having?
That's a very good question, actually. We've managed to provide a much greater level of support. The numbers I've just given you already, we've managed to provide that with our existing team. Mm-hmm. And if we go back to the days when we were formed to support veterans, right? So I looked at the VA in the United States, mm-hmm. and so I went out to recruit veterans specifically. So it was veterans supporting veterans, right? And when we transitioned, which was an evolutionary process, it wasn't like one day we made the decision and now all of a sudden we have a different mission. We transitioned, we evolved gradually, and my colleagues that were veterans who came to the team, mm-hmm. they were all people with a qualification, an education, a background in psychology as well. So they're carers. Mm. They're people who came to Lifeline Ukraine to care. And so now they have to care for other groups of people as well. And I mean, one of the ways in which we had to understand the realities that the full-scale invasion brought to this country was in the second half of 2022 when we did a series of training sessions for the team to help us better understand how we help people in certain circumstances. And one of the trainings that we did was from an expert in helping people recover from sexual violence, because we've seen how many reports of Russians gang raping people in the occupied areas. We did a training session on how we support people who are displaced by war, because that presents a certain set of emotional challenges and difficulties for people to get over. And every individual person that has been displaced because of the war faces those challenges. But then we've got 4.5 million Ukrainians in third countries as refugees, and another 7 million or 6.5 million who are internally displaced within Ukraine. The scale of the problem is enormous. But to go back to the question about staffing levels, because many of my colleagues on the 23rd of February at that time were veterans, they all got called back into military service, right? The reserve was activated on the 23rd of February. So by the 24th, they've got half a team, right?
Yeah.
And then everybody scattered as well. But we kept everything together. We carried on providing the service that we needed to provide. And I'm very proud of how my colleagues reacted and adapted to the circumstances that we were faced with. And, we know that what we do is essential for the country and it needed to carry on. And so carry on it did.
And because of technology, and maybe even because a layover from COVID, when we were all telecommuting and able to do that, they are able to actually do this from home. Yep. So they can. It's just a matter of putting in the time. Yeah.
We didn't actually change our working practices very much during COVID. We continued to work from the office. We obviously observed sensible measures and masks and distancing, all that kind of stuff. But we carried on working through the office or working from the office. It was the 24th of February that had us scattered, some to different countries. But one of my colleagues who was at our 5th anniversary has recently returned, having spent 2.5 years overseas, and she was telling me after our event that she was sitting there and she's like, I just want to be at home.
Yeah.
And so she came back to Ukraine a couple of months back, but she was working from France. Through the technologies that we've got, we could even connect people overseas. As long as they had a Wi-Fi connection, then we could route calls that way. And it was great, actually, when we were suffering the most from the blackouts, with all the attacks on the electricity infrastructure. Having colleagues in Poland, in Italy, in France meant that we were able to keep on working.
Keep on going.
Yeah, because we've got people who weren't affected by the blackouts.
You talk a little bit about having to train for certain specific things. Now, of course, the trauma of sexual abuse and what the Russians do when they occupy a town and how they behave and things like that. I'm sure you have people who are able to discuss, disabilities, having lost maybe a limb or something and how to deal with that kind of psychological trauma. Generally, I mean, obviously without going into too graphic detail, but what are the calls that you're mostly getting at the center? What are people calling in for generally? What is why do they pick up the phone and say, I need to reach out?
There's a difference between suicidal intent, which is when a person has not only considered ending their life through suicide, but they've made a plan of how they intend to do it, when they intend to do it. And we might be talking to somebody who is literally standing on a ledge and literally we're talking them down from those high spots. But then there's another stage which is called suicidal ideation. And so it's a time earlier on in what we call this continuum where a person is thinking about ending their life. They haven't come to a concrete decision about how, when, where, et cetera, et cetera. And so we will deal with people who are in the stage of suicidal ideation. So it's not an immediate threat of a loss of a person's life, but that person is having the toughest day of their existence. They are in a very, very bad state. They're super emotional and they pick up the phone to us we can go into things like breathing exercises to help somebody just to center them for a moment so that we can begin a conversation with them. So, we have the most obvious cases, which is our exact area where we work: suicidal ideation, suicidal intent. And with suicidal ideation, we stop it from becoming suicidal intent, right? But then we also have calls, and I see this in the reports that I go through, from people who are experiencing marriage problems. We get calls from people who are lonely. We get calls from people who are struggling with addictions, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or whatever it might be. So we're
and
really
I
there.
hear occasionally or increasingly from some of your staff who've told me that there's also now children that will call in. I mean, that's distressing, obviously, but one of the advantages of a service like Lifeline is the anonymity of it, because there's shame connected to some of these feelings of anxiety, despair, seeing it as weakness, that they want to reach out, they want to discuss it, but they can't do it with somebody they see day to day because they're going to see that spouse, that sister, that mother the next day. And if you've just had an absolute breakdown, there's going to be an interpersonal dynamic there. So how important do you think it is that it's just a voice on the other end of the line?
It's important that we are an anonymous source of support. We don't take personal details from people. Things come up in conversation. Somebody might share their age, or they might share where they live, or something like that. But we don't record calls. We don't ask for a specific. We are simply there. We know our job. We are there to help people and support people. And I mean, you asked about children calling. So There was a grant that we received during the full-scale invasion, and it was from a USAID funded project which was called Ukrainian National Identity Through Youth. And so I got into a discussion about this, and they said, okay, if we were to provide a grant through this funding pool, can you shift your online awareness work, your social media work, to target a younger demographic? To which I said, you know what, younger people are at a higher risk of ending their life by suicide anyway. So it's a completely logical next step for us that is one of the communities that we turn our messaging towards. Mm-hmm. And so we've done that. We had a very difficult situation where there was a game that went viral. I mean, for them it was a game. It went viral on TikTok, and it was linked to. We have a partnership with Google. If somebody in Ukraine types in search terms that might indicate that they're having suicidal ideation or thinking of ending their life, automatically Google pops up a box and says Lifeline Ukraine. This is who you need, and this is where you can get help, right? Mm-hmm. And so the way that it was worded was that somebody had taken a video of their screen, their phone screen. And said this service can help you to die, right? And the kids thought it was hilarious, and we were getting thousands and thousands of calls on a daily basis. And my colleagues would tell me, like, it was specifically at break times, school break times, and they said you could hear the other kids laughing in the background, and I was furious because it was taking away our resources, and it was a wave. I mean, it was a temporary thing. It was difficult at the time, but. And obviously that kind of thing taking up our precious time from helping other people, that's not great. But the fact that we're helping kids, we're there to help anybody. Yeah. Anybody, whether it's a child, whether it's an older person, whoever it is.
Well, nobody is untouched by this war.
Absolutely.
In this country. And we'll talk about that shortly, but it just occurs to me, and I hadn't actually written this question down to talk to you, but do you ever get the thought that maybe the Russian information warriors who are out there are interfering with you? I wouldn't put it past them. I don't know if it's capacity that they would want to spend time doing, so that's why I'm asking you. But do you ever get the impression, because they will do anything to harm Ukraine? They
will do absolutely anything to harm Ukraine. So there's always the potential for something malicious to happen from Russia. If we were to get an indication of that, we would look at ways in which we could curtail the effect that they have. But no, you're right. They will mess in everything.
Yeah.
Just because that's what they do. They're And it's what they do everywhere as well. I read a piece on The Economist this morning, actually, which was a rather long list of all of the Russian interference and subversion and arson attacks and everything that they're doing in various different countries. They're just troublemakers everywhere and anywhere, and of course. Not necessarily specifically doing something about Lifeline Ukraine or towards Lifeline Ukraine, but generally to mess with the psyche of the country. Absolutely, they're doing that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, all you have to do is look at what's happening in Kherson, with terrorizing them, with hunting down civilians like they're hunted animals with using drones.
The human safari, as people have
people are starting to call it down in Kherson. But let's pull back a little bit from Lifeline, if you don't mind. Sure. Obviously, we'll be putting links to support for Lifeline in the description below and all the rest of it. But let's pull back a little bit from Lifeline and talk about how the current situation is affecting all Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. People, when they think about war, they think about the kinetic part of war. They think about things being blown up, things. What I find equally awful in many ways, and far more insidious, is the psychological damage that is being done. There's not a person in this country who is not being psychologically traumatized by this. Either they know somebody that they have lost, that they loved, or they fear they're going to lose.
Yes.
Or every night when they go to bed, or the fact that they have to put their lives on hold. If you're 20 in this country, how can you plan? How can you prepare for your future when you don't know what that future will be? The damage that war does to a population spreads far beyond the actual bombs. Having been here as long as you have, how are you seeing the psychological trauma of this war being inflicted upon Ukrainian people?
So, one of the examples that you gave was being worried about potentially losing a loved one, right? So, as I said, on the 23rd of February, when the reserve was activated, many of my colleagues went to barracks. They went back into the military, and knowing from that point onwards that 10 of my friends were going back to war, and then many of my friends at the same time, when the full-scale invasion began, many of my friends who had never been in the military, they all went and volunteered and are still under arms now, almost 3 years later. And so that the fear that everyone has, and it's a constant nagging fear in your mind. It's always there. The fear that we have of losing a loved one who is out there fighting for us to be able to live in a relatively peaceful city like Kiev, or fighting to liberate people like they did in Kherson. That's one of the aspects that I think is very, very troubling for many people. But another example just from everyday interactions. I met a lady a couple of months ago, and there'd been an attack on Kiev. There'd been a rocket attack on Kiev, and I'd gone to a co-working space, cafe, to work a little and grab some lunch. And this lady was sitting next to me, and I could see that she was upset. And I looked at her and I said, I understand you, it's the same for all of us. And then she just started crying, and she was actually walking along the street when a building 50 feet away from her was hit by a missile. It was right in front of her eyes. And she was so shaken by this. And we ended up getting into a lovely conversation before she went off about her business. She was a photographer. She had a commercial advertising shoot that she had to do in the afternoon. And when she left, she said, "Thank you so much for talking to me. I really, really appreciate it." I mean, there's all kinds of things that are happening to us or about us every single day. And of course, the psychological pressure. Do you know the thing as well? Is that it's cumulative, right? And so I just took a trip. I just went. I'd said that I wasn't going to leave until Ukraine's victory. I was going to stay here, come what may. This is my home, right? But I decided to go and spend a little bit of time with my son, and I was overseas for a couple of weeks, and I came back a different man. Really, I did, because over time it builds up and it builds up and it builds up, and you don't have a release valve. As long as you've stayed here in this country and constantly being subjected to that stuff, everything just adds up. It's an accumulator. And so for those of us who are able to, I mean, Ukrainian men between the ages of, I think it's 20 and 60 are not allowed to leave the country at the moment. But for those of us who are able, I'd highly recommend getting away
because
resetting.
it does build. You're right. Yeah. You push it. You push. Something happens, and you're under anxiety or stress, and you kind of push that down, and then it builds, and then something else on top of that, and then you get to a breaking point, and sometimes it's too late. But you're right.
So let me jump in there.
Oh
actually,
no, sorry.
And say to you as well that one of the very first things that I learned in suicide prevention is that in most cases where you've got a suicidal caller, there is a multitude of things that their perception is, this is going wrong in life, this is going wrong, this is going wrong, and this is going, and they see the individual problems as a whole, right? So one of the things that we will do with people is well, okay, you mentioned that. Let's look at that one specific issue for a moment, and let's see if we can do something about that. And then you start to break things down into their constituent parts. But you're exactly right. Things add up over time, and then it's a variety of things at the same time. It might be relationship problems caused by losing your job, and therefore you can't support your family, and therefore you're feeling pretty kind of useless because you're used to being the breadwinner. And it's these, and then you might start drinking a little more. Vodka's cheap here. it's that culmination of problems that all come together that is very often present when somebody in a crisis situation is calling us.
Yeah, and also, you mentioned not being certain men of a certain age not being able to leave and that sort of thing. We are lucky enough that we can leave, and I am, I'm looking. We're recording this at a time where I'm about to take a trip myself, and even in anticipation of that, I feel a little bit of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize it. I see it in myself. But I wonder if one of the other reasons why an outlet like Lifeline is so useful is because there are people I know in Ukraine, and it's widespread, that are reluctant to talk to their loved ones or the people that are close to them, or even speak it out loud in a way that isn't anonymous,
mm-hmm.
such as Lifeline, because who am I to complain?
Mm-hmm.
Who am I? I mean, I'm feeling this anxiety. I'm feeling this frustration with my life and all the things that war brings to me psychologically. But there are guys out there on the front line.
Mm-hmm.
There are people in frontline cities who are losing everything. And so who am I to complain? There's a widespread, I think, attitude, not exclusively, because I in a minute we'll talk about it. I do think it's becoming more and more common to talk these issues. But do you get a sense that because there is something about not showing that you're in pain, knowing that there are others who are suffering
in worse situations? Yeah, I mean the feeling of guilt that you mentioned. When I was overseas just recently, it was the last week of August and the first week of September, and in that last week of August there was a massive bombing on Kiev while I was overseas, and I felt guilty then. I've missed that one. I'm no longer in the country, but one of the other things that
it's interesting you say I missed that one. That I wasn't here for that one. I wasn't in solidarity.
There you go.
With the rest of Ukraine, and I get that 100%. And I don't think I think it's 100% human. I think that's a totally natural thing to feel.
Yeah, it is 100% human, but then we always have to look at what is our way of processing that and coping with that. So. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I do outside of Lifeline Ukraine is that I'm also, as you know, a journalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So on the Tuesday morning, even though I'm, spending time with my son, right? On the Tuesday morning, we went and sat down somewhere, and I took a couple of hours to bash out an article and sent it off to my editors at Byline Times, and he was busy doing his stuff and everything else, and that's my coping mechanism. That's how I can relieve some of my own stresses by putting something out there, by putting an article out there that I know is going to be read by influential people, by decision makers, by certain politicians in certain countries, right? So that's one thing. But another story I remember about guilt as well. A friend of mine, I would occasionally have a beer with him, rarely, but he's a good chap, and he's a chap I've known for a long time. And I think it was the third or fourth day of the full-scale invasion. He posted a photograph from the train station in Kiev, and he wrote, "I'm guilty about leaving, everybody behind." And I wrote back to him and I said, "I carry no guilt, man. Get your young daughter to safety." I mean, and everybody made their own decisions. Did they leave? Did they stay? Did they join the military? Did they decide not to, but they've supported the military in other ways? Yeah, I mean, we've all been faced with existential choices during this period since the full-scale invasion, and since, in fact, 2014. Existential choices. People are making a choice of, do they go to war where there's a very real chance that you die?
Right.
Yeah. And those of us that didn't do that, it's right that we're gonna take a knock. We're gonna feel the fact that we haven't done that. I mean, I'm in touch wood. I'm in pretty good health, right? But I'm in my 50s now. I'm 52 years old this next birthday, and I have no military experience, right? So I went on the 24th of February when I went to the Territorial Defense Recruiting Station saying, "Give me a gun." There was a guy who was standing on the steps, and he said, in Ukrainian, "Якщо нема воєнний досвід, то побачення. If you don't have military experience, go away. Like we don't need you today." And he simply said, like, "We have this many volunteers, we have this many weapons." Right? We give the weapons to the people who know what they're doing with them, right? So,
well, and to from each their abilities to help to those who have need. I mean, you have an outlet in terms of being able to write and express yourself and be proactive in that way. And for other people, it's going to be Lifeline for their outlet.
Yeah.
But everybody does need an outlet. And when I was in essence deputy bureau chief for CBS News in Baghdad, one of my responsibilities was to be cautious of and to make my other the bureau chief or people back in New York aware of there's a person here who's approaching breaking point, and for their own good they need to get out of here.
Yeah.
Because you're no good if you break.
Yep.
If you stay too long, if you're involved in X, Y, or Z too much, or you dwell on this or you dwell on that, and you get to a breaking point, then you're no good to anybody else. So having an outlet like Lifeline, I think is really, really important. But let's go back to this overall question of psychological well-being and health in Ukraine during what is an incredibly difficult period. I do sense that there's a difference, that mental health is now more acceptable to talk about. Some people, for a variety of reasons of which we've already discussed, will prefer to do it, anonymously or through other outlets. But I also do think that going to a person and saying, Yakti, how are you? That person doesn't just give a perfunctory, I'm fine. That sometimes you will get the, I'm having a tough day, man. I'm having a real tough day. And the other, and it is okay. Well, tell me about it, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because there is a sense of commonality here. We're all going through this. Again, not a single Ukrainian is untouched by this war. Do you think that the perception of mental health and mental health care has changed because of this, overwhelming commonality of trauma?
So to answer your question, I'll go back to that blank sheet of A4 paper and the third thing that I wrote. I wanted Lifeline Ukraine to be a catalyst for a national discussion about mental health. And we've contributed to that. We've certainly played our part in that, and the awareness work that we do through our social media platforms has we get 400,000, 500,000 impressions every single month. Through.
And an impression is basically
somebody's seen your post, and I mean
interacted.
The interactions is always a fraction of the number of impressions, but we'll have 500,000 impressions per month, and then whatever number of shares and likes and so on. But but actually, I want to go back to what you were saying about the newsroom, and one of the things that the Lifeline Ukraine has been doing for several years now is we go into organizations and we provide training sessions. And so we might be invited to go and speak about psychological resilience during wartime, right? And I won't name the organization, but one particular training session that we've just done was for a newsroom. We were invited to go in and work with the news team, and that leads me actually to say something that I want to say more generally about journalism in Ukraine through this period of time, right? So the people who are mostly responsible for covering this war, for writing about it, they're the Ukrainian journalists who are also directly affected by it, right? So So they're not only, and they're not being parachuted into a country to cover something, because it's a breaking event or they're at home. This is them. This is their country.
Yeah.
This is their homes, their families. And yet they continue professionally to write throughout this period.
Yeah.
Throughout this period. And
whether
it's
they're
really
on the
quite
front lines or whether they're interviewing, the pain and interacting with the pain of the Ukrainian people.
They are doing that while this war is against them and against their own country. So it really is remarkable. But going back to answer the question, and it seems actually that the war itself has been a catalyst for this discussion about mental health. And the First Lady, Olena Zelenskaya, started a program called TIAC, How Are You? The exact question that you just asked, TIAC. And it's a platform that promotes the idea of talking more openly about mental health, about our psychological state, and then lists resources where people can find support. And Lifeline Ukraine is one of the resources that's listed there. Obviously, it's nice to have that recognition from the First Lady's office.
The First Lady of Ukraine. Yeah.
And at our anniversary event, we had a representative from the TIAC organization that was there as well. I had a lovely chat with her after the formal part of the proceedings. But it has become, through the work of Olena Zelenskaya and others, it has become more normal in this society here, whereas 5 years ago when Lifeline Ukraine began, or even 3 years ago before the full-scale invasion, it was something. You mentioned stigma earlier on.
Yeah,
it was something that was stigmatized. We don't want to talk about that because of reasons X, Y, and Z. Well, actually, those stigmas are perceived, and in real life, any of us can be affected at any time. And this is something I say when I'm meeting with business leaders, for example, and talking about more support for Lifeline Ukraine from businesses. And I say it could be one of your colleagues tomorrow that calls us, and it might be a colleague from the boardroom or a colleague from the warehouse. I mean, it literally could be anybody. Dark psychological moments. They don't care about race, gender, class, station in life.
Well, you talk about stigmatization of mental health care, and part of that is because this is a very traditional culture. For men, there's very much a sense of machismo. But in addition to these cultural things, which in some ways we haven't, you find that all around the world, but there's an additional issue here as well, in that psychological care in the Soviet Union was actually oftentimes used as another way to jail somebody who was politically incorrect, which is where the phrase comes from, that the Soviets perceived you as being politically incorrect. So that they may not throw you into the gulag or the prison system. They could throw you into a mental health institute, in quotation marks.
Yes.
So there's lots of reasons why people have been in the past reluctant to engage with mental health. But I perceive a difference happening because this is happening. Everybody's going through something.
Yes.
And when you point out this to your, when you do your seminars with folks, that it's in everybody's best interest that mental health is addressed before it gets to a crisis point, because then you're going to have to deal with it. Your employee is going to get to a breaking point. Best to head that off at the pass. So, yeah, obviously. But it's. Let me ask you another question though. When you talk, you rightly pointed out that Ukrainian journalists are at the tip of the spear sort of situation where the trauma is. And so you're advocating for mental health for them. What about your staff? Your staff gets phone calls with, and sadly, I'm sure not all of the phone calls are successful. Sometimes they do end with people, committing, self-harm. How do you make sure that your staff is also cared for when it comes to the burden on them from this kind of work?
I had dinner last week with a lady who was here for a conference, a British lady. She was here for a conference on the state of provision of psychological support in Ukraine. And we went for dinner, and she told me that her son was a volunteer with the Samaritans in the UK. And on his very, very first call, where he was solo, so they'd be working together with other people that could, jump in and assist and so on his very, very first call when he was solo, the person took their life. And she was telling me how, the organization itself surrounded him with support, and, they'd invested a lot of time to train him, and they didn't want this experience to be off-putting, and that he would end his relationship with them. But it's not specific to Lifeline Ukraine. It's the nature of the work that we do. The hotline in the United States of America is 988, I think it is now, because your police services are 911, right? And so 988 is now your national suicide prevention hotline in the United States. That it could happen to anybody there as well.
And we lose so many veterans.
Yes.
This is suicide prevention is a huge issue. But anyhow, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. The number of veterans at one point some years ago who were taking their lives by suicide was 22 every single day in the United States. And that was the catalyst actually for a viral movement that was 22 push-ups for 22 days.
Yes, I remember.
So lots and lots of people were doing that.
But anyhow, anybody who is touched by war, and the closer in proximity you get to it, the more at risk I think you are for mental trauma. So let's just continue. I mean, you're making sure, I am sure, knowing you, Paul, that your people are well taken care of. But what I want to know is how.
So that was the question that you asked, and I was just about to answer it.
Before I interrupted you rudely.
No. In the earliest days of planning and researching how one operates a suicide prevention hotline, I have no clue. I've just been dropped into this, and I needed to learn. That was one of the very first things: the health, the well-being of your colleagues who are. They're the ones you mentioned, the tip of the spear, right? They're the ones that are taking the calls. They're the ones that are dealing with that. And so what I first had was, in my management structure, we had a resident psychological coordinator who was there to support the team. And then I'm sitting in the office one day, and I've always had this very, very open policy with my colleagues. Like, my desk is in the call center; it's next to you. I'm not sitting in a separate office or anything. You can come and talk to me at any time. And like 6 of them came up to me all at one time, and they said, we need to speak to you about something. And I said, okay, it looks serious. And we went into the conference room, and they said, when we're having our supervisory sessions, it's with somebody who is a part of the organization's management. We would like to have an independent supervisor. And I looked at them, and I'm like, this has obviously been building for a while, because 6 of you have come to talk to me about this. You could have just come earlier on. I absolutely get why you're asking for that, and we'll do it. And so then we interviewed actually 2 potential supervisors, and the team themselves voted for who they wanted to work with, and then it was completely anonymous, and it's an independent person. That particular psychologist has, of recent months, been doing more and more work himself with the military. And so actually we've just started with a new team of supervisors. And one of the first things that one of my colleagues said to me at our 5th anniversary event was exactly that. We've just started with a new supervisor, and he starts telling me how it's going, and he's clearly thrilled. He's clearly thrilled. And so, I took that seriously from the get-go, and we have structures in place to make sure that my colleagues have got somebody to talk to. Any qualified mental health professional will also have somebody that they go to talk to themselves anyway, right? So some of my colleagues have their own person that they want to talk to, but the supervisory sessions that we organize for the team, they're extremely valuable.
Well, I think it goes back to that thing that we discussed earlier. It's kind of it's a very intimate topic that you're discussing. You're really you're putting yourself out there emotionally when you're talking about these kind of things. So sometimes maybe anonymity or an independent voice that you can trust and that you pick yourself, or whether it's how you an outside contractor or whatever it is. So but it's important to talk to somebody. It's always important to talk to somebody.
It's important to talk to somebody, but here's another thing as well, actually. And again, this wasn't something that I had said or suggested. It was just something that I learned about that was normal practice. Many of my colleagues actually use pseudonyms when they're working at Lifeline Ukraine, and so Sasha will walk into the office, and then while he's
so maybe he
helping
can
people,
disassociate.
He's Volodya. Yeah.
He can disassociate. He can put on a role of Volodya.
Yeah.
So that he can compartmentalize. That's
exactly
fascinating,
right.
Paul.
And again, that was them. I don't even know where that idea came up from, but when I noticed it, I'm like, well, that makes perfect sense.
Well, leave it to a Ukrainian to invent and to develop new techniques.
Mm-hmm.
We see it all over the place here. As we kind of round down here, you've been coming here for a very long time. I have as well, but you've been living here.
Mm-hmm.
You know that there's a lot of trauma, generational trauma in Ukraine, whether or not you're going back, however far back you want to go, always being colonized and being oppressed and repressed by the Russians. And this goes through the Holodomor, this goes through the Second World War, this goes through this, that, and the other thing. There is generational trauma in this country. And it hasn't always been dealt with the most healthy way because it's been part of the Russian Empire. And it's basically, here's a bottle of vodka and off you go. Do you think this war will contribute to further generational trauma? Or do you think that Ukraine is at a place where it, not only because it's breaking away from the Russian kind of oppression and all the rest of it, and the Russian way of life sort of thing, or whether or not it is just, because there has been so much trauma in this country's history. Is this the off-ramp where they start to really deal with this generational trauma and start to heal?
So one of the things that you mentioned in the question was the Holodomor. And the Holodomor, for listeners who may not know, was 1932, 1933, and many millions of Ukrainians were starved.
Nobody, no one family went without being touched by starvation.
Exactly.
Death by starvation. Exactly. Imposed by Moscow.
That's 32, 33, and it was imposed by Moscow. Exactly right. So a few years later, 1939, the Second World War breaks out. Right now, the USSR was not involved until it was invaded in 1941. But in that short time space from 32, 33, the Holodomor, to the beginning of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, and obviously first and foremost was in Ukraine and through Ukraine.
And some of the most brutal fighting.
But when you have a real life memory of what's just happened less than a decade ago, it's no surprise that a certain number of Ukrainians said, well, actually, maybe it's right to join these guys. Like they just tried, the other ones just tried to kill us a decade
starve
ago,
us to death. Yeah.
But to answer the question going forward, rather than looking at history, do you know what I see? First of all, I see that there is, and I wrote this another article at the end of 2022, and I wrote, Putin has no path to victory next year, or ever, right? And obviously the editors changed the headline by the time it was published. But I was looking then at the end of 2022, like what were Russia's aims when they came into Ukraine? What did they state they were going to do? Right? They wanted to demilitarize the entire country. The opposite has happened. They wanted to denazify. We don't need denazifying, but it would the code was for taking over the entire country and changing the way that Ukrainians have developed of living within their state. That was what they wanted to do. And by the end of 2022, they'd been chased out of Kharkiv, they'd been kicked out of Kherson, they'd lost the battle for Kiev, they'd lost their initial war aims to take Kiev in 3 days. And since then, I mean, okay, we see this awful, slow war of attrition. I say slow, I mean slowly moving forward just to take the next destroyed
town, which used to have 40,000 people.
Yeah, or 15,000
or 15,000 people.
I mean, that's what they're doing. But if you look at the big parts of this war, if you look at Crimea, if you look at the strikes, if you look at the invasion of Kursk Oblast, if you look at the strikes into Russia on their air bases, on their oil infrastructure, and so on, Russia has no path to anything that they can declare to be a victory, but Ukraine does, because Ukraine's goals are very clearly stated. We know exactly what we want, and it is the return of all Ukrainian territory, and that's that. And so I absolutely believe, and I've believed it since the 24th of February and even before, Ukraine is going to win.
Yes.
Ukraine is going to win. So I don't think that we're going to have an additional contribution to this generational trauma that you're talking about. What I see in actual fact is that, after the victory, that's when we'll take stock. That's when we'll be able to see what this has actually cost us in terms of personally as a nation. That's when we take stock. That is going to be accompanied by the euphoria of having defeated Russia and
finally gained your independence
and their unprovoked invasion, and finally having absolute independence and freedom and security.
Something they've
and so on
sought for centuries.
But the other thing that I see that's going to happen as well, and there's a big conversation going on for almost the entire period of the war, is how do we pay for the restoration of Ukraine afterwards? But I think that process, I think the rebuilding of Ukraine, where we know that many hospitals have been targeted. We know many educational institutions in the country have been targeted as well. So imagine those schools and universities and hospitals when they're rebuilt.
Yeah.
And we're on the path to the EU. And we're increasing standards. We don't want to align with the kind of standards that they have in Russia, which is what Russia would impose if they were successful in controlling Ukraine. That would be terrible. But what we're actually going to have is the complete reverse. We're going to have a glorious period of investing in the future of this country, and I'm very much looking forward to remaining here and to seeing that and
so
being part of it.
Therapy through reconstruction.
Yeah.
You talk about
new beginnings.
New beginnings.
Yeah.
And brick and mortar can sometimes be cathartic in terms of healing.
It's tangible. It's tangible.
It's a tangible. I have fixed this, which means that things are fixable, and I can fix them within myself as well.
One step at a time.
One step at a time.
One
problem at a time.
Yeah.
I'll take you on there. Yes, absolutely. Let's go back and round this up talking about Lifeline. You've just had your 5-year anniversary. Well done, you. You have had good times and bad times. You are funded generously internationally, but sometimes that support has not been as maybe as forthcoming as in the. Were you affected by that period of time in which the United States went through its moratorium on aid to Ukraine, or was that separate?
No, that didn't affect us directly. Yes, we're lucky right now to be operating under a 12-month grant from an organization called Global Giving.
Okay,
that kicked in from the 1st of July. So,
but even if the United States government, sometimes can be a little wishy-washy. Maybe not in your case, but I'll point my finger at the GOP in Congress when it comes to support for Ukraine and criticize them highly. But if government isn't going to do it, the Americans who may be watching this, my audience, I know a lot of them will be wanting to send you support. So how best can my audience support Lifeline Ukraine?
Our website is not deceptively named at all. It's lifelineukraine.com. There is a donate button on the website. Actually, yesterday as well, we also launched a revised version of our website. I'm very pleased to see that. It's been a few years
Great.
since we'll
put the link in.
It's always good to be modernizing and refreshing and using the latest technologies and so on. So there are various ways to donate to Lifeline Ukraine through PayPal, through Patreon, through Global Giving. They have their own crowdfunding platform as well, and so together with my social media colleagues, we'll be doing a bit of a blast on this in the coming period.
More
Number
than
one,
happy to help with
because
that.
we've celebrated 5 years. Number two, the other thing as well. So in the presentation for the anniversary event, I'd got a placeholder text that we'd provided almost 100,000 instances of support, and I asked my colleague, what's the actual number? And the actual number as of yesterday was 99,610. Right, that's how many times we help people. But as I said earlier on, with the global giving grant, we are currently able to provide about 4,000 instances of support every month, but the demand is 6,500, right? So we're launching this campaign called Close the Gap, right? I have to get from being able to help 70% of the people who need our help to helping 100% of the people who need our help. And the first step to begin to close the gap, we want to add one more consultant in our busiest shift. So from 6 o'clock in the evening till midnight, that's that's when we get the largest volumes of calls. And so for just $2,000 of additional revenue every month, I can add a third consultant to that important shift. And we'll go from being able to provide 70% of the instances of support that we needed to maybe 85%.
You got a QR code?
We have a QR code.
We will be putting the QR code down there somewhere right now.
We have a QR code.
Good.
And
good. And
various,
I'll put all the links in. And all the rest
various
of it.
different options for
well,
people
it's a good cause, Paul. It's and it's important that we support it because it's not just guns, and it's not just medical equipment in terms of physical, care. Injury. Let's wrap this up with a two-part question. And one part is the sad part is you live here, I live here. You've been living here for a long time. What is the mental health status of the Ukrainian people and their suffering right now? And in addition to that, on the light side, what I think will be the light side, and certainly I consider it to be the light side, what is the diagnosis for the future for that it seems to me we're in a dark place, but I can see a place where it gets a lot lighter. I'd like to get your input on that.
So if we took a snapshot of the present, and obviously everybody's different, but I'll go back to something that I said in a previous answer. I personally will be taking stock at the end of the war, and I think there are many people who are putting off that reckoning of what we're going through because we're still in it, right? So, this isn't the time for reflections. This is the time for continued action, continued support to the military, continued whatever it is we can do to contribute to Ukraine's eventual victory. And so I think for many people, I think it is a question that's being paused, and we will come back to when we've got breathing space. Mm-hmm. That's one thing, and for the future, do you know what I see as well? I've had lunch today before this interview in a place that first of all opened up, an Asian restaurant. It first of all opened up in one location, and I kind of liked the place, and I would go there like once a week or something, and then all of a sudden it was closed. And then a few days later, this is since the full-scale invasion, a few days later, there's graffiti spray and there's an arrow and it says 100 yards, right? And so what they actually did was they started a new business. It was more successful than they anticipated. And then they moved into larger premises, which is where I've just been for my lunch today, right? I see good friends of mine got married last year on the 24th of February. They told me they wanted the date to stand for something positive. There are people. There's a taxation scheme which is called the private entrepreneur scheme here, right? So it's a very, very effective low tax rate. Lots and lots of people use it. The number of private entrepreneur registrations in the last few months has just gone through the roof. People are getting married. People are having kids. People are investing in businesses. People are doing things that they'd been putting off for years because do you know what? There is no time like the present. And I think that is reflective of, again, the snapshot of today, but also for the future as well. These are doggedly determined people, and they've got something good to fight for, and they will celebrate and thoroughly deserve this victory. And that, for me, is the positive way that the country's going to go.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And while we're in it now, and let's not put on rose-colored glasses, people are in pain, real honest to God pain here. And it is pervasive. There's not a single person who isn't suffering from this war, even, as I say, even if it isn't, being on the front line or whatever, the myriad of psychological. So Lifeline is providing a really important service now while people are struggling currently. So please support them. And thank you, Paul, for your efforts. But I think you're also right. I see it every day. I see it in the way people rebuild or repave roads.
Yeah.
Or they are they're renovating businesses or houses, or they're having children, or they're marrying, or they're starting new businesses. Because despite all the fact that we're in a deep, dark place right now, I think it's universal that Ukrainians are also looking to a bright future. And that's hope is a really, really powerful thing.
Yes, it is.
Thanks very much for coming. Thank you for what you do. Congratulations on 5 years, and we'll see if we can get more support for you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. All right. Thanks for your time, Paul.